July 8, 1944. The island of Saipan in the Pacific. A lone American Marine walks into a cave complex occupied by hundreds of Japanese soldiers. He's 18 years old, barely 5 feet tall, armed with only a pistol and a few grenades. By all military logic, he's walking to his death. But Private Guy Gabaldon isn't afraid. He's angry. The night before, he watched thousands of Japanese soldiers launch a suicidal banzai charge against American positions, a desperate, horrifying human wave attack that left the beaches covered with bodies. Now, he's going to convince the survivors that continuing to fight is pointless. Over the next few hours, this teenage Marine, acting completely on his own, without orders or backup, will persuade over 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians. It's one of the most remarkable individual achievements in military history. And it happened because a Mexican-American kid from East Los Angeles grew up speaking Japanese. This is the true story of Guy Gabaldon, the Pied Piper of Saipan. To understand how Guy Gabaldon accomplished the impossible, we need to go back to his childhood in Los Angeles. Born in 1926 to Mexican-American parents, Guy grew up in the tough streets of East LA during the Great Depression. His family was poor, really poor. By age 10, Guy was essentially living on the streets, getting into trouble, heading down a path that probably would have ended in prison or worse. Then something extraordinary happened. Guy became friends with two Japanese-American brothers, Lane and Lyle Nakano. The Nakano family saw something in this tough street kid and invited him to stay with them. Eventually, they essentially adopted him, taking him into their home as one of their own. For Guy, it was a completely different world. The Nakano household was structured, disciplined, and steeped in Japanese culture and traditions. They spoke Japanese at home. They followed Japanese customs. They taught Guy about honor, respect, and self-discipline, concepts that were foreign to a kid who had been surviving on the streets. Guy absorbed everything. He learned to speak Japanese fluently, not just conversational Japanese, but the formal, respectful language used in traditional settings. He learned about Japanese culture, customs, and ways of thinking. He became, in many ways, culturally Japanese, while remaining Mexican-American by birth. It was an unusual upbringing that would save his life and the lives of hundreds of others just a few years later. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the United States, and everything changed. Anti-Japanese sentiment swept through America. Japanese Americans, including the Nakano family who had taken Guy in, faced suspicion, hatred, and eventually internment. EO 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in February 1942, forced over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, into internment camps. The Nakano family was torn from their home and sent to a camp. Guy, who was Mexican-American, wasn't interned, but he watched helplessly as the family that had saved him was imprisoned by their own government. For Guy, now 16 years old, it was a formative experience. He saw firsthand the difference between the Japanese people he knew, kind, honorable, hardworking, and the propaganda portrayal of Japanese as monsters. He understood that individuals weren't their government's policies. And he knew that on both sides of the Pacific there were ordinary people caught up in a war they didn't start. But Guy was also an American. When he turned 17, he tried to enlist in the Marines. They turned him down. He was too young and too small. Guy was only about 5'4" and maybe 120 pounds soaking wet. He didn't look like Marine Corps material. Guy waited until he turned 18 in March 1944, then enlisted again. This time, they took him. The Marines needed every man they could get for the brutal island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. Guy went through basic training at Camp Pendleton, California, then shipped out to join the 2nd Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division. His commanding officers had no idea they'd just recruited someone with a unique skill set that would prove invaluable in the Pacific War. Guy never mentioned his Japanese language ability or his upbringing with a Japanese family. In the climate of anti-Japanese sentiment, it seemed safer to keep quiet. In June 1944, just 3 months after enlisting, Private Guy Gabaldon found himself landing on the beaches of Saipan as part of the massive American invasion force. Saipan was a critical target, a Japanese stronghold in the Mariana Islands, close enough to mainland Japan for B-29 bombers to reach Tokyo. Taking Saipan would bring the war directly to Japan's home islands. The invasion began on June 15, 1944. Over 70,000 American troops hit the beaches, facing approximately 30,000 Japanese defenders. The Japanese strategy was simple and brutal. Defend every inch of ground, make the Americans pay in blood for every yard gained, and when defeat became inevitable, die fighting rather than surrender. For American Marines, fighting the Japanese in the Pacific was unlike any warfare the world had seen. German soldiers would surrender when their position became hopeless. Japanese soldiers almost never did. They would fight to the death, launch suicidal banzai charges, or commit suicide rather than face the dishonor of capture. Guy witnessed this firsthand. He saw Japanese soldiers charging American positions in human wave attacks, knowing they would die. He saw wounded Japanese soldiers detonating grenades rather than accepting medical help. He saw civilians, men, women, and children, jumping off cliffs rather than surrendering to American forces. It was horrifying, and Guy understood something that many of his fellow Marines didn't. This wasn't because Japanese people were inherently suicidal or savage. It was because they had been told that Americans would torture and kill them if they surrendered. Japanese propaganda painted Americans as monsters who would commit atrocities against prisoners. For Japanese soldiers and civilians, death seemed preferable to capture. Guy realized he might be able to do something about that. He could speak Japanese. He understood Japanese culture and concepts of honor. He could communicate in ways that other Americans couldn't. So he decided to try something that his superiors would have absolutely forbidden if they'd known about it. He started going out at night, alone, to convince Japanese soldiers to surrender. Guy's first solo missions were terrifying gambles. He would slip out of the American lines at night, moving through the jungle toward Japanese positions. He carried his M1 carbine and a few grenades, but he knew that if he encountered a large group of Japanese soldiers, his weapons would be useless. His only real weapon was his voice. He would approach caves or foxholes where Japanese soldiers were hiding and call out to them in Japanese. Not the harsh, commanding Japanese of an enemy, but respectful language that acknowledged their honor as soldiers. "I know you've been ordered to fight to the death," he would say. "I know you've been told that Americans will torture prisoners. But I'm here to tell you the truth. You'll be treated with respect according to international law. Your war is over. There's no shame in surviving to return to your families." The first few times, it didn't work. Japanese soldiers would either fire at him or remain silent. Guy would retreat and try again elsewhere. But gradually, he learned what worked. He learned to appeal to Japanese concepts of honor and duty. He learned to emphasize that their commanders had already failed them by putting them in an impossible situation. He learned to promise that surrender was not dishonor, it was survival. And slowly, incredibly, it started working. 1 or 2 Japanese soldiers would emerge from a cave, hands raised. Then 5 or 6. Guy would disarm them, treat them respectfully, and march them back to American lines as prisoners. His fellow Marines were stunned. Here was this baby-faced 18-year-old kid bringing in prisoners when most Marines had never seen a Japanese soldier surrender voluntarily. How was he doing it? Guy's commanding officer, Captain John Schwab, was torn between admiration and fury. On one hand, Guy was bringing in valuable prisoners and intelligence. On the other hand, he was repeatedly leaving camp without permission, going out alone on unauthorized missions, and violating basically every military regulation in the book. After one particularly successful mission where Guy brought back a dozen prisoners, Captain Schwabe called him in and threatened him with court-martial. "Gabaldon," he reportedly said, "if you go out there alone one more time without orders, I'm going to have you shot. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Guy replied. And then he went out and did it again, because Guy had realized something. He could save lives, American lives, by gathering intelligence and reducing enemy resistance, and Japanese lives by convincing soldiers to surrender rather than die in pointless banzai charges. As the battle for Saipan ground on through late June and early July, Guy's reputation grew. He became known as the Pied Piper, the Marine who could convince Japanese soldiers to follow him like the legendary Piper led rats out of Hamelin. It was a nickname that stuck. Guy developed a system. He would scout during the day, identifying caves and positions where Japanese soldiers were hiding. Then, at night, he would approach alone, call out in Japanese, and negotiate. His success rate was remarkable, far higher than any other American efforts to convince Japanese soldiers to surrender. Part of his success was linguistic. He could speak formal, respectful Japanese that showed he understood the culture. But part of it was psychological. Guy was genuinely sympathetic to the Japanese soldiers' situation. He knew they had been lied to by their own propaganda. He knew many of them wanted to survive but couldn't see an honorable way to surrender. Guy gave them that honorable path. He explained that their duty to their emperor didn't require suicide. It required survival so they could eventually return to rebuild Japan. He told them about international laws protecting prisoners of war. He promised that Americans, unlike what their propaganda claimed, didn't torture prisoners. And critically, Guy had a secret weapon: credibility. Because he looked young and non-threatening, and because he spoke Japanese so fluently, Japanese soldiers sometimes thought he might be Japanese American. That made them more willing to trust him. If someone who was ethnically Japanese could serve America and survive, maybe surrender wasn't the ultimate dishonor they'd been told it was. By early July, Guy had personally brought in over 100 prisoners. His commanding officers had given up trying to stop him. Captain Schwab, recognizing that Guy's unofficial missions were producing valuable results, essentially looked the other way. Guy would disappear at night, reappear in the morning with prisoners, and Schwab would pretend not to notice the blatant violations of military discipline. But Guy's greatest achievement was still to come. July 7, 1944, was the day everything changed on Saipan. The Japanese defenders, recognizing that the battle was lost, prepared for one final massive attack, a banzai charge involving thousands of soldiers and civilians armed with whatever weapons they could find. Around 4:30 a.m. on July 7, approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and armed civilians launched a massive human wave assault against American positions near Tenapag on the northern part of the island. They came in waves, screaming "Banzai!", a battle cry meaning 10,000 years that expressed their willingness to die for the emperor. The American defenders, many of them support troops rather than frontline infantry, were overrun in places. The Japanese assault penetrated deep into American lines. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in the darkness. Artillery batteries were overrun, their crews fighting desperately with pistols and bayonets. By dawn, the attack had been stopped, but at terrible cost to both sides. The beaches and fields were covered with bodies. Thousands of Japanese attackers lay dead. Hundreds of Americans had been killed or wounded in the desperate overnight battle. For the survivors of the Banzai Charge, Japanese soldiers who had somehow lived through the night, the situation was desperate. They were scattered, disorganized, low on ammunition, with no cohesive command structure. They retreated into caves and the remaining jungle areas in the northern part of the island. Guy Gabaldon looked at the carnage and felt something snap inside him. All those deaths, American and Japanese, had been pointless. The battle was already won. The Japanese had no hope of victory. But they had thrown away thousands of lives in a suicidal attack because surrender was considered dishonorable. Guy decided he was going to stop the killing. He was going to find the survivors and convince them that staying alive was more honorable than dying for nothing. His fellow Marines thought he was crazy. After a mass Banzai charge, Japanese soldiers would be at their most fanatical, most dangerous. Approaching them alone would be suicide. Guy didn't care. He grabbed his pistol, some grenades, and a few canteens of water. Then he headed north toward the caves where he knew Japanese soldiers would be hiding. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable individual achievements of the entire Pacific War. On the morning of July 8, 1944, Private Guy Gabaldon walked into the cave-riddled hills of northern Saipan. He knew that hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Japanese soldiers were hiding in the area. He also knew that many of them would be wounded, traumatized from the failed Banzai charge, and possibly in a state of suicidal despair. Guy's plan was simple, or insane, depending on your perspective. He would find Japanese soldiers, talk to them, and convince them to surrender, just like he'd done dozens of times before. Except this time, instead of small groups of 5 or 10 soldiers, he was dealing with potentially hundreds. He approached the first cave complex carefully, listening for sounds of movement. He could hear voices inside, Japanese soldiers talking. He took a breath and called out in Japanese, "I am an American Marine. I speak Japanese. I want to talk to your commanding officer." Silence. Then excited, confused chatter from inside the cave. An American who speaks Japanese? Was this a trick? Guy continued, his voice steady and respectful. "The Banzai charge failed. Many of your comrades are dead. The battle for Saipan is over, but you don't have to die. I can guarantee you will be treated honorably as prisoners of war." More discussion inside the cave. Then a voice called back in Japanese, "How do we know you won't kill us?" "Because I give you my word," Guy replied, "and because killing prisoners violates international law. We Americans follow the rules of war. Your propaganda has lied to you about what happens to prisoners." It was a critical moment. Guy was standing exposed in front of a cave full of armed soldiers. If they decided he was lying, they could easily kill him. But Guy projected absolute confidence. He spoke with the formal respect of someone who understood Japanese culture. He appealed to their sense of honor. After what felt like an eternity, a Japanese officer emerged from the cave. He was exhausted, wounded, and clearly at the end of his rope. Behind him, Guy could see more soldiers, lots of them. Guy bowed respectfully. The Japanese officer, somewhat surprised, bowed back. "I am Private Gabaldon," Guy said in Japanese. "I understand you and your men are in a difficult position. The battle is lost, but you can still survive with honor." The officer studied this young Marine who spoke flawless Japanese. "We were ordered to fight to the death." "And you fought bravely," Guy replied. "No one can question your courage or your loyalty. But your commanders are dead or have abandoned you. You have no supplies, no reinforcements, no hope of victory. Dying now serves no purpose. But surviving means you can return to Japan when the war ends. You can rebuild your country. You can see your families again." It was a masterful psychological approach. Guy acknowledged their bravery, respected their sense of duty, but reframed survival as the honorable choice. But here's where Guy pulled his masterstroke, the bluff that made everything possible. The Japanese officer asked the obvious question. "If we surrender, what guarantee do we have of safety? There are many of us. What if your soldiers panic and shoot us?" Guy looked the officer in the eye and delivered his bluff with absolute confidence. "I have an entire company of Marines surrounding this position. They're under orders not to fire unless you resist. But you need to understand, if you don't surrender, artillery and airstrikes will destroy these caves. You have 1 hour to decide." It was a complete lie. Guy was alone. There were no Marines surrounding the position. No artillery was targeting the caves. No airstrikes were coming. Guy had left the American lines on his own, and nobody even knew exactly where he was. But he delivered the lie with such certainty, such calm authority, that the Japanese officer believed him, or at least couldn't afford to disbelieve him. The officer went back into the cave to consult with his men. Guy waited outside, maintaining his confident posture even though his heart must have been pounding. If they called his bluff and came out shooting, he was dead. If they stayed in the caves, he had accomplished nothing. Everything depended on his performance being believable. After 15 agonizing minutes, the officer emerged again. "We will surrender, but I must be able to guarantee my men's safety." "You have my word," Guy said. "Order your men to come out unarmed, in an orderly fashion. I will personally escort you to the American lines. Anyone who tries to harm you will answer to me." The officer nodded and began calling orders into the cave. And then something remarkable happened. Japanese soldiers began emerging from the cave. 1, 2, 5, 10. They kept coming. Guy had expected maybe 20 or 30, but they kept coming. Wounded soldiers, young conscripts who looked barely old enough to shave, older veterans. They filed out in orderly lines, laying down their weapons as instructed. Guy maintained his calm demeanor, but inside he must have been terrified. There were dozens of them now, 50, 75, 100, and they were still coming out. If even one of them decided to attack him, Guy would be overwhelmed instantly. His pistol held 8 rounds, he had a couple of grenades. Against 100 armed soldiers, he was helpless. Everything depended on maintaining the illusion that he was in control, that Marines were watching from the surrounding hills, that resistance would be futile. But Guy had started something he couldn't stop. Word began spreading through the cave system. If one group was surrendering, others wanted to know why. Japanese soldiers from adjoining caves began calling out questions. Was it true that Americans didn't torture prisoners? Was surrender really possible? Guy found himself negotiating with multiple groups simultaneously. Each time, he repeated his bluff about Marines surrounding the position. Each time, he promised honorable treatment. Each time, more soldiers emerged from the caves. By noon, Guy Gabaldon, one 18-year-old Marine acting completely on his own, had over 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians standing in orderly groups, unarmed, ready to march to American lines. 800! It was an almost incomprehensible number. Guy had convinced more enemy soldiers to surrender than most entire regiments captured during the Pacific War. And he'd done it alone, with nothing but his language skills, his understanding of Japanese culture, and an audacious bluff about non-existent backup. Now came the hard part, getting them safely back to American lines without anyone getting killed. Guy organized the Japanese prisoners into columns. He put the officers in charge of maintaining order. Then he began the long march back toward American positions. One teenage Marine leading a column of 800 former enemies through a battlefield. It must have been a surreal sight. Guy, barely 5 feet tall, walking at the head of a procession of Japanese soldiers that stretched hundreds of yards, moving through terrain that had been a battlefield hours earlier, passing the bodies of Japanese soldiers who had died in the Banzai Charge, comrades of the men who were now surrendering. As they approached American lines, Guy faced his final challenge. American Marines, spotting a massive column of Japanese soldiers approaching, prepared to open fire. To them, this looked like another attack. Guy had to act fast. He called out in English, "Hold your fire! These are prisoners! I'm Private Gabaldon, and these men have surrendered." The Marines were stunned. Who the hell was Private Gabaldon, and why was he leading what looked like an entire Japanese battalion? Guy marched his prisoners into the American lines and reported to his commanding officer, Captain John Schwab. Schwab, who had threatened to court-martial Guy for his unauthorized solo missions, could only stare in disbelief at the mass of prisoners. "Gabaldon," Schwab finally said, "what the hell did you do?" "Brought in a few prisoners, sir," Guy replied. "Maybe 800 or so." The surrender of over 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians on July 8, 1944, was unprecedented in the Pacific War. Individual Japanese soldiers occasionally surrendered, but mass surrenders were virtually unheard of. What Guy Gabaldon accomplished single-handedly was something that entire regiments with all their firepower couldn't achieve. The prisoners were processed, given medical care for their wounds, provided with food and water. Many were severely dehydrated and malnourished. True to Guy's promise, they were treated according to the rules of war. No torture, no executions, no abuse. This humane treatment had an unexpected benefit. Some of the Japanese soldiers who surrendered to Guy later helped convince other holdouts to surrender as well. They could testify that the Americans had kept their word, that surrender didn't mean death or torture. In the final weeks of the Saipan campaign, more Japanese soldiers surrendered than in any previous Pacific battle, in part because of Guy's actions and the credibility he had established. Guy himself continued his lone wolf missions throughout the remainder of the Saipan campaign, and later during the Battle of Tinian. By the end of his Pacific service, he had personally captured or convinced over 1,300 Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender. No other individual in the Pacific War came close to that number. His commanding officers, who had threatened him with court-martial, now recognized him as one of the most valuable Marines in the division. But there was a problem. Guy had accomplished everything through unauthorized, unsanctioned missions. He had repeatedly violated orders, gone out alone without permission, and taken risks that should have gotten him killed.
How do you reward someone for breaking every rule in the book but getting spectacular results?
Initially, Guy was recommended for the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. The recommendation detailed his actions on July 8 and his overall contributions to capturing enemy soldiers. For a private to receive the Medal of Honor was rare, but his achievement seemed to warrant it. However, the Medal of Honor recommendation was downgraded to the Navy Cross, still the second highest decoration, but not the Medal of Honor. The exact reasons for the downgrade remain somewhat controversial. Some historians suggest it was because Guy's missions were unauthorized. Others point to possible discrimination. Guy was Mexican-American at a time when racial prejudice was common in the military. Guy received the Navy Cross in 1945, but the controversy over whether he should have received the Medal of Honor persisted for decades. His fellow Marines who witnessed his actions believed he deserved the higher decoration. His commanding officers submitted statements supporting an upgrade. In 1960, a movie called Hell to Eternity was made about Guy's life and his actions on Saipan. The film starred Jeffrey Hunter as Guy, a casting choice that bothered Guy since Hunter wasn't Latino, and brought his story to a wider audience. The movie took some liberties with the facts, but captured the essence of Guy's remarkable achievement. The publicity from the film renewed efforts to upgrade Guy's decoration to the Medal of Honor. But despite repeated attempts, including appeals that reached the highest levels of the military and government, the upgrade never happened. Guy Gabaldon remained a Navy Cross recipient, not a Medal of Honor winner. Guy didn't let the controversy define him. He lived a long life, dying in 2006 at the age of 80. He remained proud of his service and his achievements, regardless of what medals he did or didn't receive. So, how did Guy Gabaldon accomplish something that seems impossible? How did one teenage Marine convince 800 enemy soldiers to surrender? Several factors came together. First, language and cultural understanding. Guy didn't just speak Japanese, he understood Japanese culture, concepts of honor, and ways of thinking. He could communicate in ways that showed respect and understanding, not just translate words. Second, timing. Guy acted immediately after the failed Banzai charge, when Japanese soldiers were at their most vulnerable psychologically. They had just witnessed the futility of suicidal attacks. They were exhausted, wounded, and demoralized. Guy offered them a path forward that didn't require death. Third, credibility. Guy's youth and non-threatening appearance actually worked in his favor. He didn't look like a typical American Marine. His fluent Japanese made some soldiers wonder if he was Japanese American. This made him more trustworthy than other American negotiators would have been. Fourth, the bluff. Guy's claim about Marines surrounding the position was a complete fabrication, but delivered with such confidence that it seemed credible. The Japanese officers couldn't afford to gamble on calling his bluff when the alternative was being trapped and destroyed. Fifth, genuine respect. Guy actually cared about saving Japanese lives. He wasn't trying to capture enemy soldiers for military advantage. He was trying to prevent unnecessary deaths on both sides. That sincerity came through in his negotiations. And finally, courage. Guy took insane risks. He walked alone into situations where he could have been easily killed. His absolute fearlessness and confidence convinced others that he must have advantages they couldn't see. Guy Gabaldon's achievement had implications beyond his individual actions. He demonstrated that even in the Pacific War, characterized by its brutality and the supposed impossibility of Japanese soldiers surrendering, mass surrenders were possible if approached correctly. His methods influenced later American psychological operations in the Pacific. Leaflets dropped on Japanese positions began using language and appeals similar to what Guy had used successfully. Loudspeaker broadcasts employed Japanese-speaking personnel to make surrender appeals. The approach didn't always work, but it worked more often than the previous assumption that Japanese soldiers would never surrender under any circumstances. Guy also challenged assumptions about who could be an effective warrior. He was small, young, and from a minority background that faced discrimination. Yet he accomplished more than soldiers who fit the traditional warrior image. He proved that intelligence, cultural understanding, and psychological insight could be more powerful than physical size or conventional military tactics. The story of Guy Gabaldon is remarkable not just because of what he accomplished, but because of how he did it. He didn't defeat 800 enemy soldiers through superior firepower. He didn't capture them through tactical brilliance or military might. He convinced them to surrender through understanding, respect, and an audacious bluff. In an era when the Pacific War was characterized by brutal, no-quarter combat, where surrender was rare and mercy even rarer, Guy Gabaldon demonstrated that another approach was possible. He showed that even enemies who had been taught to fight to the death could be reached through communication and cultural understanding. His story is also a reminder of the importance of individual initiative. Guy acted outside the official command structure, violated orders, and took unauthorized risks. Military hierarchy and regulations would have prevented what he accomplished. But by trusting his instincts and his unique skills, he achieved results that no amount of conventional military force could match. What can we learn from Guy Gabaldon's incredible bluff? Perhaps the most important lesson is this: sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't firepower, it's understanding. Guy's ability to speak Japanese and understand Japanese culture saved more lives than any rifle or artillery piece. His story also reminds us that prejudice and discrimination limit our capabilities. Guy grew up poor and faced discrimination as a Mexican American. The Japanese American family that adopted him faced even worse discrimination, eventually being interned by their own government. Yet this unlikely combination, a Mexican-American kid raised by a Japanese family, produced someone uniquely capable of bridging the divide between two enemies. If the military had known about Guy's background, they might have viewed him with suspicion. If he had been prevented from taking his unauthorized solo missions, thousands of people, American and Japanese, would have died unnecessarily. Sometimes the most valuable contributions come from the most unexpected places. On July 8, 1944, an 18-year-old Marine private walked into a cave complex on Saipan occupied by hundreds of enemy soldiers. He had no backup, minimal weapons, and absolutely no authorization for what he was about to do. By any rational measure, he was about to be killed. Instead, through a combination of linguistic skill, cultural understanding, psychological insight, and sheer audacity, Guy Gabaldon convinced over 800 Japanese soldiers to surrender. It remains one of the most remarkable individual achievements in military history. Guy Gabaldon proved that wars are fought by people, and people can be convinced, reasoned with, and persuaded. He proved that understanding your enemy can be more powerful than defeating them. And he proved that sometimes the greatest acts of courage don't involve pulling a trigger, they involve putting down your weapon and using your words instead. The Marines called him the Pied Piper of Saipan. But Guy Gabaldon was something more than that. He was proof that one person with courage, understanding, and an audacious bluff can change the course of a battle, and save hundreds of lives in the process.